Actually, tonight's lecture came into being because as Jan also said, I'm really working together with Gideon on certain things, and we meet regularly. And but you always write these novels, and I heard about them, and you have to come to Antwerp, and they have to have you. And say, well, people haven't invited me, so I'll be there. And so that's what happened. And of course, it's a pity she can't be here herself tonight, but I talked to her on the phone right before, and so she said she will listen to what I tell tonight. I have to stand here in order to be in the picture. Or yeah. So, hi, Vivian. Yeah. I really will do something tonight that one shouldn't do, especially not as a literary scientist or literary critic. Talk about your own books is not something you really should do, but that's actually what I was asked to. And so I will try to give you a little insight in what it means to be a writer of criminal novels, especially Jewish criminal novels. And so that's also what the title of this lecture is, a complicated double function, and the double function is not mine of a professor and a criminal writer in this case, which also is kind of double function, but the double function about a detective rabbi. And I will not give a very long talk, I will talk shortly, like I don't know exactly how it comes out in the end, but I will give you time to get into discussion with me. I think this is even more interesting than simply listen to a monologue from my part, because I know that there are always questions and there are always people who say, I always wanted to write criminal novels, how do you do it? And so maybe if one of you has this question, we also can talk about this a little bit. So here is the scenario I want to give you. A popular teacher of the Jewish primary school in Zurich, bachelor, in his late 50s, and not an enemy of any man, does not appear one morning for lessons and is found dead at home. Okay, not a big surprise because it's a criminal novel, so you have to have a corpse. Even though it may have been his weak heart that failed the service in the end, he had previously been beaten on the head with a heavy object. That's what the police finds out very quickly. Death by violence. So a few years ago, it all started with this scene in my first criminal novel, Kain's Opfer, because Kain's sacrifice, Cain from the Bible, Cain's sacrifice or Cain's victim. Opfer, if some of you know German, really means both words, and I'm glad I wrote it in German, so I didn't have to decide which one. So it's Kain's Opfer. This was the birth moment of Gabriel Klein, the fictitious rabbi of the real existing Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Zürich, so the big Jewish community of Zurich. So the community with this name exists, and I was its member for quite a few years, but the rabbi, of course, is a fictitious rabbi, although not the present, but the past rabbi's wife once came to me and said, but you don't talk about him, do you? I could deny it with good conscience. Ever since that moment of the birth of Gabriel Klein, he has been suddenly drawn into murder and manslaughter stories in his congregation or circle of acquaintances, and he has become an intelligent investigator who sometimes makes terrible mistakes. And again, as the author of the Rabbi Klein criminal novels, I'm asked, why a rabbi? For some readers of somewhat older years, the questions could also be, and maybe some of you would also ask this, are you inspired by Camelman? I don't know whether the name of Camelman, there rings a bell for any one of you, but in Switzerland or in Germany, when I give readings, this is a very common question. Harry Kemmelmann, who more than 50 years ago in the US wrote very successful criminal novels about his Rabbi David Small, was certainly inspired by G.K. Chesterton's Potter Brown when creating his detective character. And actually, to be honest, I read one of those novels of Kemmelmann when I was a teenager. It was in my parents' home. We had one of these German translations of Kemmelmann. You know, it's always these titles. It's a weekday, and then the rabbi, like Saturday, the rabbi didn't eat, or Sunday, the rabbi came late, or something like that. So one of them I read. And I still know that I read it, but I'm not too much into criminal novels as a reader. And so when I finished my own first novel in 2013-14, I thought, well, maybe I have to look in Wikipedia about Kemmelmann, because people will ask me. I know that some people know, especially those who already were readers in the 60s. And I don't remember anything of him, so I want to look it up. And then I read it in Wikipedia, and then I didn't remember it. I read that his name was Rabbi Small. And if you know a little bit of German, you know that Klein means the same. And I was sure, I was like, well, you took the same name. And so it simply was already in print, or I was sure I couldn't change the name of my rabbi. And so he's also called Klein as Rabbi Small of Kemmelmann. Now, I've never read anything by Chesterton, and I knew their books existed, but still, it didn't influence me too much, and so you really can ask the question, why a rabbi, and what kind of character has this rabbi to be in order to be a good investigator, but also in order to be a good rabbi, and maybe both of these functions are really intertwined, and that's actually what I think I try to make happen. As is generally known, there is nothing more annoying than authors who analyze their own novels. And I like to make every effort not to fall into this trap. If I still fall into this trap, so you raise your hand, you're interpreting yourself, don't do that, okay? But I try not to. At the same time, I want to try to explain what it is that makes Rabbi Klein and his environment so special, and maybe even ideal for criminal novels. As Jan has said, in the meantime there were 5 already have appeared since 2014. So 14 to 18 I really every year could write one and publish one book. 19 will be an empty year, and the 6th one is now with my literary agent, so I hope the 20 there will be another one. And in Switzerland, I may say that they are more or less well known. In Germany, a little bit. So he has become a more or less established figure of the criminal novel scene. I refrain tonight from talking about other people's novels, mainly. Originally, I was exactly taught, and I'm teaching, to talk about other people's books, because I'm a literary critic, but exactly this I will not. I also won't talk about Kemmelmann. I will not talk about Faye Kellerman, maybe a name that is known to you, who is an American Jewish criminal novelist writing about Jewish subjects. And I also want to talk about Michael Chabon, or Michael Chabon, maybe the name is known to some of you, who wrote a brilliant novel about 12 years ago, Yiddish Policeman's Union, which is playing in a piece of alternative history, actually, which is playing in Alaska, in a like fictitious Jewish autonomous region that could have been built there in the 1940s had the Americans taken up a plan that existed at that time to save German Jews from Germany and bring them to Alaska in an autonomous region to build it up economically. But this all never happened, of course, as we know. So he wrote a novel that plays like in Alaska at the fictitious end of this fictitious autonomous Jewish region. And if you happen to be able to obtain this book, the Yiddish Policemen's Union of Michael Chabon, get it and read it. But I won't talk about it. It's really all about Rabbi Klein tonight. And I won't talk long, that I will say we will enter discussion. But first and foremost, who is this rabbi? Gabriel Klein, when it starts, and I really go with him with his age, he becomes older every book. Yeah, so he is not always like Donald Duck, you know, who is always the same age, or his nephews, you know, they never grow up. Rabbi Klein is not like that, and especially you won't see it so much maybe with him, but with his daughters, of course, who grow up, who come to finish school, and so on and so on. I think it is important to have this rhythm of life in it. And when he was young, he made a doctoral thesis in history, and he planned to make a university career. And this career came to a standstill. About this I write in the first novel, and a few people thought they detected some university experiences of mine, which actually I don't comment, but the fact is that much I can maybe tell you, that there was a point in my career when it wasn't clear whether I would change to become a rabbinical assistant in the same community where he became rabbi. I'm not a rabbi, but he did what I might have done if I hadn't made a university career. At a certain point it was not so clear whether it would go on, and exactly at that moment they invited me to a meeting, the president of this community, and asked me whether I am interested, and then I said, look, I'm at a very crucial point of my career, and if it will happen that I become professor in Basel, so I won't come, and otherwise we maybe could come back to talk to each other. And maybe he is, in that way, he made a career that I never made. We might say that, although Rabbi Klein is not Alfred Bodenheimer, and also not the second Alfred Bodenheimer. But of course there are autobiographical things in it, so much I can tell you here. So his university career comes to a standstill, he doesn't get on, he's frustrated, and then really he becomes a rabbi on the second educational path. His community finances him the education to get what you call in Hebrew a smicha, which is an ordination as a rabbi. You may have to learn a lot about the Jewish law in order, of course, to be able to take this, to be able to fulfill this task, and that's what happens with him. But this intellectual background, of course, never gets lost, and his university background is the reason why it is the intellectual approaches that fascinate him again and again through his cases. So he knows the practice of research from his academic life, and from his Jewish life, of course, and from his Jewish education, he knows the Jewish sources, and he knows how to read texts scrupulously, which I think is something very crucial to Jewish education. Text lecture, close reading, as you call it in literary science. At the same time, he is thirsty for innovation, so for new kinds of text reading, not reading the text as hundred thousands of you have done it, but find new approaches to the text. A criminal case for him is the symptom of a society that has gone off the rails. The horrible failure of any form of communicative behavior. But it is also an epistemological enigma. I want to stress that in the cases of Rabbi Klein, it is never a very cool killer who comes and kills someone who someone else asked him to kill him or something like that. It's not a thriller kind of criminal novel too, but it's always a disaster of communication that is not working anymore, of failing of people to find them one another. And I think this is in reality also the reason for most those kinds of criminal cases that really happen. So I'm not interested in so much in thrillers or in frightening people, but I want to show milieus, I want to show cases of problems between human beings that can't be solved or seemingly can't be solved until they lead to a catastrophe. So, according to Rabbi Klein, just because it simply can't be that a person really goes so far as killing someone else, the fathoming of truth becomes for him an intellectual challenge. And the problem of finding out how it can be that someone really gets to this state of killing is one of the crucial motivations of his function as an investigator. And of course he is not an investigator, he always falls into cases where suddenly he has to become interested, and very often he says, I don't care about that, and let the police do it, and in the end he can't escape it, and he doesn't want to escape it too. And his wife always tries to stop him and says, you will get only into problems, and mainly she's right, but he always gets involved in some way. There is also the context that generally in criminal novels is of an importance that may not be underestimated. Whether an action is taking place on an abandoned farm or in a vibrating metropolis, whether the milieu is one of bankers hungry for success, cunning, eloquent professors, or ordinary petit bourgeois, whether each one of the scenarios is, of course, of the highest relevance for the genre. You don't write the same novel maybe in a banking milieu that you write in a milieu of poor people or workers or farmers or whatever. It is not that humans would again and again be driven by the same motives, impulses, affects, desperations, errors and calculations that finally are the basis of crimes, no matter if this is on a campus in Oxford, an infamous New York neighborhood, or an Alp valley in Tyrol. But the way people struggle with the crime itself, with the detectives, and last but not least, with themselves, differs considerably between these worlds. So motives may be similar in the end, whether it's happening in the banking business or in a very lonesome valley somewhere, but how do people struggle with the fact that a murder happened? That can be very different. It has become clear, far more than I could have planned in this, could have planned in a basic concept of my novels, that the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Zürich, the community, the United Synagogue, you might maybe call it, in Zurich, is an almost ideal context for criminal cases. And I'm not sure I would tell this to a community in Zurich too, but to you I can tell this quietly. It is a microcosm in the middle of a big city, because it's a microcosm of very relatively few people. There are in Zurich area living around 8,000 Jewish people. The community has about itself, this community has about 2,500 members or so. There are other communities around, Orthodox communities, Reform communities. It's a small microcosm, you might say, but they're not living in a village where you really only have those 3,000 to 8,000 people, but they're living in a vibrating Central European city. Within itself, this community is a highly heterogeneous accumulation of people consisting of the whole spectrum of social belongings and political views, of natives for generations, as we have still in Switzerland. In many Jewish communities in Europe, you don't have this unbroken tradition that never has been touched by the Holocaust. Yeah, I think that's something very important, because Swiss Jewry has simply, it has really started to exist in a more modern way, like Jews have been allowed to live there also in the 19th century, mainly Alsatian and southern German Jews, afterwards also in the beginning of the 20th century, Jews from Eastern Europe who came, but they simply stayed there. I mean, the Holocaust happened, as we know, in Europe, and all of Europe was shaken by it, especially, of course, the Jewish community. And in Switzerland, life went on. So who is sitting in Switzerland looks back on a community with a long tradition who never had to change anything, mainly. You know? And of course, you have also migrants, as today you have everywhere, but you have this very bourgeois Judaism that never had to go away, never had to escape, and so on. Of course, also you have a rabbi who gets around a lot as a public figure and comes into contact with all kinds of crimes, Rabbi Klein. But always these crimes are in a kind of sometimes quite complicated connection to this microcosm. Because how does a rabbi get into contact with crimes? The crime happens in his community, or it happens to someone who is close to his community, or he walks by when someone is killed, which also can happen. But he doesn't look for crimes. He's not a policeman, and crimes are not brought to him because it's his profession. He simply falls over it, or in some way someone contacts him who has a problem with this crime. Whether he is related to the victim, whether he is himself a suspect, which can also happen, and he asks the rabbi for help to escape the suspicion that could be that the police could find against him. And of course, the rabbi has always to take into consideration: am I helping to someone who really is guilty, that he wouldn't want to do? But sometimes it's also difficult for him to tell the police that he knows about something, about someone in his community, because he also feels responsible for the people in his community. So you want to go to the police and deliver them. So you see all the problems, really, the dilemmas he is torn between. In any case, it is here in his community where he also grew up. He didn't come there as a rabbi from somewhere. He grew up in this community, himself from Zurich. It is in this and in his community that his thinking, feeling, and acting has its roots. Here you find all those that are enervating in most and inspiring in the most profound way. And the Swiss Jews, I don't know whether you know Swiss Jews, maybe you see one here, but they neither, and that's very astonishing, they neither find it sensational that they are Swiss, nor that they are Jews, and even not that are both at the same time. Yes, maybe they are so special just by taking themselves for the most normal thing in the world, although it's really something very strange to be a Swiss Jew. And precisely, they're being so much the same as other Swiss people and other Jews, and so different from them. Because Swiss Jewry never has been shaken by catastrophe, thanks God, Swiss Jews well, we're normal, we're standard, you know, and in reality, they're really something you almost don't find, neither in the Swiss world, because they're Jews, and they're very different sometimes from the Swiss, nor in the Jewish world, because they're Swiss, and they're very different from all Jews. So this is the context in which it is sensational enough when one person dies of a violent death, in which all sorts of antennas are immediately raised, even rumors can simmer, but in which people are also stirred up and looking for orientation, and in which, at best, all sorts of motives that are hardly been suspected before become visible, which could have led to that conscious member of the congregation, or someone who was close to a member of the to that member of the congregation who is in some way in contact with a crime, or to someone who was close to a member of the congregation, to those who have had to end their lives before time. So what is the rabbi's role within this constellation? Let's exemplify it with the example given above, the first of my novels, Kain's Opfer, when I talked about it. First, it is rather by accident that Rabbi Klein is confronted with a case. His phone number in the story was the last one dialed by the murdered teacher. So this teacher was found dead. He was found dead before he was killed. He made one last telephone call, and the dialed number was the number of Rabbi Klein, so it's clear that the police wants to know what was all about, that they talked. Actually, they didn't talk, because the rabbi didn't take the phone, and the teacher left a message on the com box. Do you call it com box here too in Belgium? I don't know. Yeah, on the voicemail. Right. He simply excused himself for not being able to take part at an evening class the rabbi holds every week for a group of men. So all of you know that this last phone call was to say, sorry, tonight I won't come. And that's it. But the rabbi was the last number, so the police turns to him. But you know, in a criminal novel, the banal is never banal. From the moment on when Detective Banziger, which is a really Swiss name, Banziger, I'm sure you also wouldn't be able to spell it, because no one can do that except Swiss. So that's her name, Karin Banziger of the Zurich police. She's questioning the rabbi, first by phone, afterwards in her office, and things become complicated. Gabriel Klein relates to the case in a twofold way. First of all, he's a private person who was befriended with the victim. He was his friend. And secondly, he is an official person. He's a rabbi. And those two approaches are quickly mixing. And that's always a problem when you have an official role, an official function as a rabbi, and at the same time you're the friend of the same person you have to deal with. The situation gets even more complex by the fact that suddenly the police hitches him up, asking him to translate Hebrew mails of the victim, the teacher, who was an Israeli by his origin, in search for potential hints for motives of the crime. So say we have here Hebrew mails, our translator is sick, that's the situation, and we have to have someone we can trust who translates these emails for us, so we can find out whether in these emails we find any hint to his death, to why he was murdered. So he not only is the official representative of the community and a personal friend of the victim, at the same time he also becomes in some way someone who is in a police function and who has to make translations for the police. And You can feel maybe that things become complex here. So he takes over this task, and this leads him to first conclusions and severe dilemmas. Problems get additionally tightened when he has to prepare the obituary for the dead and finds inconsistencies in his curriculum. Because as a rabbi, of course, he will be the one who gives the obituary, and he has to find out a few details about his life to talk about him. And then when he starts to look at his papers at the school and his working contract and so on, he sees that there are things not quite fitting one to the other. The rabbi tries to read the case, like the biblical story of Cain and Abel, that's where the title comes from, and as the book of Job, he begins to suspect where to look for missing puzzle pieces, but he does not know whether he will find them. And soon another point becomes clear. In the Jewish world that is so small and so global at once, his search can only be successful if he gathers knowledge that is available outside Switzerland. Because that's also something I think it's typical about the Jewish world. It's very small communities, but they all have contacts to all parts of the world, and that's what's happening here too. He has to get information from the United States, and he manages to get these information with a phone call. But he has to find more discrete things that he can only get from Israel. And so he has to travel to Israel too, to Jerusalem, with a very unexpected success, let's say, that he has there. He's not finding what he's looked for, but something else. The investigator, who has before never been especially interested in criminal cases as a rabbi, becomes more and more involved. And he becomes more and more ensnared in questions of loyalty and in compulsions to decide between alternatives of which he doesn't know at that moment which is right and which is wrong. He is not the police. The police has to find the murderer, and that's it. And he has always to look to whom he has to be loyal, not because they are his bosses, because they are the members of his community. And once he tells the police something about someone that makes him suspect, at once this person gets into prison, a family father with many children, and he's not so sure that he really is suspect. So he gets into terrible problems, internal problems with himself. Shouldn't I have told them, or was it right to tell them? What is justice? To whom do I do justice by telling things like that? So this is the situation he lives in. Of course, the plot plays with questions of milieu, with idiosyncrasies of Jewish societies and their habits. One of the comments that are standard in reviews of those criminal novels, as well as in oral feedbacks by readers, is that Rabbi Klein novels are giving an introspection in the world of Jewish life. And there is not a small number of often but not always Jewish readers who draw the whole lot of fun, and in rare case also fury, in their reading from the assumption that the author, which means me, might use the plot and its figures in order to settle old scores within the Jewish society. But this can only be confirmed when you confuse the typical in a society with its reality. There are people, I know that, in Zurich, who make lists and to try to show who of the figures is who in reality, you know, which is strange, because sometimes they know that I meant someone who you don't even know personally or never met. But this is I don't know exactly how you can read a criminal novel like this, but they really think I want to make revenge, or I don't know exactly. It's very strange, because I'm not so close to this community anymore that I should think about how can I take him in a novel and so on. But that's how many people read these novels, which on the other hand shows me that they're not so far from reality, which is also nice. But the actual area of conflict that arises here is that between the privacy and the public function of a public official, and if you look at it carefully, also between the public sphere within the community and the role of a community rabbi in the Swiss general society. So if you look at these novels, you see that the rabbi has a role within and he has a role without. Within, he's the kind of person who has to take care of people whom they turn to with their problems, but of course also the one who is actually employee of a community and who has people in the board who try to tell him what to do. So it's not so easy to be a rabbi, I think, and I was one, but that's what I try to show too, that all kinds of interests he should have to meet. And the other side, for the police, he is the representative of the Jewish community whatsoever. So he's not a private person and still is a private person. The central question is, which information gathered or received in which of one's function are to be used on what purpose and towards whom? A rabbi is trusted. For the members of his community, he is often a person to whom they turn in the highest confidence, and also outside of his community, he is seen as a trustworthy person. But then, how do you handle explosive information? If on the one hand, you see yourself as a servant of the Jewish community, while on the other hand, you want to serve justice. Especially if you know things you rather wouldn't want to know, or have the opportunity to hear things that you want to know for other reasons than the person who tells you about beliefs. So if he thinks you want to know, if the person you talk to thinks you want to talk to him and know things because you want to help him, but in reality you want to find out things that might interest the police in order to have more information in the criminal case, it's a very, very delicate situation. You can believe it to me because I saw it with Rabbi Klein. In such a situation, it is possible, or rather quite sure, that you get into conflict with the police because you don't always deliver what they want, and sometimes you simply want to include them in your own research. But of course, also they always have informations that you don't have, and they won't give you the information because they don't want you to be an investigator. That's the other side of the story. You chase after things that would be proven wrong for a long time if you had only asked the detective before. But the detective maybe never will tell you. On the other hand, you will also find a firm lead to which you believe that for whatever reason you should follow rather alone without handing all informations at once to the detective for several reasons. This can end up in triumph as well as in disaster. In Rabbi Klein's first case, Kain's Opfer, it is definitely disaster, and a disaster he tragically caused himself because he didn't draw the right consequences when he actually did solve the case. He solves the case and he draws the wrong consequences from solving the case, and by this he causes a terrible disaster. It is a disaster, moreover, that by a hair ruins the rabbi's own life. Because a rabbi, maybe more than everyone else, lives by the social capital of his reputation. If that social capital, to talk with Bourdieu, within the university here, so maybe this name has also to be called, if this social capital is gone, let's say because he has misled the authorities, there remains no basis for the exercising of his activity. But the trust that the rabbi enjoys can also be fatal in other respects. What if the police themselves come up with the idea that he should sound out other people of the community? For the only price of serving justice, of course. Whom exact a rabbi could be persuaded to do something so mean like this on such noble grounds. In Rabbi Klein's third case, Der Messias kommt nicht, the Messiah won't come, that's the name of the book, this is at least occasionally the predicament he gets into. And this happens not even within his own community, but in the community of Basel that time, after he has himself talked around to act as a substitute for a community Shabbat for his Basel colleague who is suffering from a burnout. So you should never help others, actually. By the way, not long ago, a Swiss student has analyzed this novel, The Messiah Won't Come, in a paper she had to write for her final school examination. She has compared it with another criminal novel of a well-known Swiss author of criminal novels, Petra Ivanov. You won't know her, but she's a quite known Swiss criminal author. Surprisingly, this student concludes that Ivanov's novel, I don't know this novel, but I know it from her essay only. The student concludes that Ivanov's novel, in which there are not to be found any clearly religious motives, still is more religious in its outcome than my novel is. Why? She writes that in Ivanov's novel, a detective who is close to nature, loves freedom, and posits himself consequently against all evil, and who, moreover, finds his great love in this novel, offers a sort of redemption for the reader. And my novel definitely doesn't offer redemption, because in the end, I don't know, maybe you will read it, so it's a spoiler, but it's in German, so I don't know how many will read it. The murderer goes out free. Okay? Not good for someone who looks for redemption. At least according to what I think maybe a Christian understanding, this novel of Ivanov seems to offer a kind of religious inspiration. But my case, Rabbi Klein's third case, where religion plays a crucial and overwhelming role in manifold ways, the readers are denied any religious momentum in the end, any momentum of redemption at least, because the murder remains unatoned, because the murder remains unatoned, the murderer is not caught and continues a very successful life. By the way, Rabbi Klein might have avoided this frustrating outcome himself had he acted in a more sophisticated way. So you see, he's a very clever person, and he makes a lot of terrible mistakes in the end. Not always. There are not all the cases are disastrous in the end, but those two. As a matter of fact, I condone this conclusion. Writing about religiously living and thinking people is something entirely different from fulfilling religious hopes or aspirations of readers. Religion and belief, as major elements of Rabbi Klein's spiritual and even more about his intellectual world, do not spare him from major frustration and failings. I don't associate religion with redemption, but with a kind of coping with reality, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. In my criminal novels, if my criminal novels, are not fulfilling religious expectations or hopes of some readers, hoping for redeeming outcomes and endings, they do, as a matter of fact, deal with questions that have a big impact on Jewish existence. In my latest published novel, it's called Im Tal der Gebeine, in the valley of, of bones. Yeah, it's a quotation of Yecheskel, 37, where he sees the valley of bones that are filled afterwards with flesh, and there is skin over them, and they are revived and come back to life. You know, I don't know whether you have it before you, but it's a very famous passage in the Prophet of Ezekiel. So, not important. This is the title of this novel. In this latest novel of 2018, it is the destiny of children who escaped the Holocaust, lost their parents, and survived as children very far away from where they born. You know about the Kindertransport, if you heard about this, the children who came to England and survived there while their parents in Germany were deported and murdered. So this is one of the crucial issues of this novel. Of course, many years after, when those both sisters who survived at that time are very, very old ladies. And on the other hand, this novel also deals not directly, but in the mirror of a rather grotesque meeting of European rabbis in Vienna, who are worried with the anti-Semitism in present Europe. So there are very important questions of Jewish life and Jewish history also dealt with in these novels, not always in a redeeming way. In its predecessor novel, the fourth one, it was another very specific Jewish question, this of a homosexual son in an ultra-Orthodox family whose parents break every tie with him, so he should have no bad influence on his brothers and sisters, although their heart is bleeding from it, from cutting the ties with the son. For many readers, and most of them, I can say most of them, who never were in contact with anything Jewish, it really is the first time they are confronted with questions of Jewish life, its everyday issues, but also historical and political implications. As a consequence, it is not rare that I am asked if I have any pedagogical or didactic intentions about presenting Judaism to an uninformed German-speaking public. My answer, of course, is no. I can hardly imagine anything more boring than a criminal novel with didactic ambitions. On the other hand, writing about Jewish life in Europe today with a claim to authenticity far from panic or idyll, writing on Jewish customs not as something semi-magical or exotic, but as a form of life-generating normalcy for those who adopt it, such writing can without doubt open doors of understanding for those to whom Jewish life has always been strange and inaccessible. But in order to transport this authenticity, in the end, your investigator has to be a human being that allows a sort of identification, of nearness, exactly because he is not perfect, but a complex, contingent personality. A joke that my late father used to tell, and actually many who knew him and who know my novels take him for the model of Klein's late father, who is often quoted with sarcastic statements in the novel, but this is not very important if this is true or not. Anyway, my father always told one joke about a Jew who worked as a tailor on workdays, but on Shabbat or on Jewish holidays, he was the cantor of the synagogue. All tailors said that he was a good cantor, and all cantors said that he was a good tailor. I tend to think that it is not so with Rabbi Klein. He is up to both his functions, his profession as a rabbi as well as his occasional activity as a detective. I don't think the detective would say he's a good rabbi and the rabbis would say he's a good detective. Sometimes, though, he is a failure in both functions. He is privately involved in his cases, which is never good, and not always he manages to separate his private issues from his public function. But there can be the same problem the other way around. his public duties spreading into his private life. His wife, Rivka, a very important person in all those novels, is sometimes driven to despair by this overlapping of duties and crossing of boundaries. But there is also one occasion when she benefits from his involvement. In Klein's second case, Das Ende vom Lied, or the end of the song, where she herself becomes a suspect to have committed a murder and is arrested by the police, and he can manage to free her from arrest. Altogether, Klein's rabbinate becomes a more complicated version of the condition humaine. Klein's passionate fight against the dominance of passions, and they talk about the passions leading people to become murderers. This fight against the passions becomes a mix between what you call in German Beruf und Berufung, meaning profession and calling. What does this mean for an author? Lately, at a public reading in Switzerland, someone in the audience asked me how I myself experienced the Rabbi's development over the last few years when all those novels appeared. So I had to answer him that the Rabbi as an investigator, as well as a human being, always remains somewhat unpredictable, as we all maybe are, if we haven't let ourselves be pressed completely in social templates. And in the end, that's maybe what it's all about when we create a criminal novel, and it's personal. To create an atmosphere which leads the reader smoothly through a plot without sparing him the full complexity of life and death. Consequently, the challenge of placing yourself in front of a computer screen always remains a very vivid one for the author, who by doing so is mainly hoping that there will not be a situation where professors say that he's an accomplished author of criminal novels and authors of criminal novels will think that he's a smart professor. I thank you.